Hello everybody. This is a lecture devoted to introducing you to the topic of literacy. A huge topic, much to say about it. This is just an introduction to that topic. So if you're new to the topic of literacy, this is good. If you're something of an expert in it, it will be old hat for you. Nothing much new here. Okay. Let's first of all begin by thinking about different models of schooling that have impacted our thoughts on literacy development. A number of different models. One very popular traditional historical model of literacy has been learning as skill building, or what we tend to call in the business the industrial model. What is the industrial model? Well, we have practices designed to be efficient, uniform, and competitive. Our literacy practice create a workforce that is compliant, punctual, and accountable. We in schools are concerned with delivering the same content and curriculum with the same standards for everyone. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? Our reading moves from simple to complex, right? You remember, I don't know, maybe some of you folks are too young, but you remember the simple basal readers, the kind of see Dick run stuff, see Jane run, and then you develop from there into more complex things. Students complete reading worksheets and other activities focused on accuracy and performance. Right? These are all things that perhaps many of you have experienced when you were just learning how to read. There's not much room for students to take things in their own directions here. It's all about measurement, completing your level, and moving to the next level. Right? We use leveled readers in schools, don't we? Remember your kids coming home, friend, if you're a parent, right? You have, I'm on the yellow level, or I'm on the orange level, or the blue level, right? Lots of mechanical exercises that repeat. So you use lots of magnetic letters to form rhyming word lists. Then you match each word with a picture, those sorts of things. And there's lots of prefab, or the term is basal readers. These are actually pretty handy little packages for teachers and students. They come with, lesson plans. There's a teacher manual. There are answer keys. Hooray! Sequencing of, different things that you'll do stage by stage. There's worksheets and there's workbooks. It's designed to make your environment in your classroom help you design it, right? So that, you've got something, it's been tried, it's been tested, it's ostensibly been designed by experts who know about literacy and these sorts of things. And so, very often teachers find these things very, very helpful for them. But it's all part of the industrial model of education and literacy development. Well, there's another form. Learning as investigating a question. This is the inquiry model, folks. It differs from the one-size-fits-all idea behind the industrial model by flowing from diverse student interests. Okay, so here it's very much influenced by John Dewey, the idea of the centrality of interest in education. Students are given some power or control over what they'll learn and how they'll demonstrate to others what they know. So it's not all the same thing all the time with everyone. Different ways of demonstrating what you know, different ways of demonstrating this or that skill or attitude, right? Instead of focusing on a basal reader or basal reader exercises, readings are drawn from all sorts of different sources commonly available. Like, well, not so much anymore, but in my day, it was newspapers or magazines, right? Websites, lots of websites, books. You can imagine comic books, all different things. Lots of ways into topics under study, and there's cross-curricular connections you'll be making. That's the inquiry model. There's learning as problematizing the status quo. This is what we call the critical model of literacy development. So here, students are invited to think about assumptions made by what they're reading and by the curriculum. This involves, considering questions of power, gender, social structures, and identity, right? So, you read a story, for instance, to your students, and the story's told from one person's perspective. Well, what about the other people in the story? How come we don't get to hear it from their perspective? One of my favorite storybooks for teaching in social studies, even in high school, is this storybook. It's a picture book called Encounter. You'll find it on Amazon, for instance. A picture book called Encounter. It's all about Christopher Columbus and First Contact. But it's not told. See, when I was a kid, the story of Christopher Columbus, so-called discovering North America, we were told it from his perspective, weren't we? But this is an interesting story because it's actually told from the perspective of a little child, a little native child, and how this child saw Christopher Columbus. And so different assumptions, right? You read through and you get kids questioning, whose voice is being heard, who is not being heard, what kind of questions are being asked, what kind of questions are not being asked. This will make them critical thinkers, critical readers, right? They won't be so likely to be duped by, when they get older, by politicians or by, people who are in power who say, this is the truth. They'll be able to question when somebody says something. And they'll be able to question their own selves, right? Like, oh, well, just because I think that, well, what about other people's perspectives? It works well with biographical writing. It's valuable to talk or learn about historical and cultural backgrounds alongside of book or storybooks you were investigating. And it's also cross-curricular. So it's another model of literacy development. And by models here, you can see, well, geez, do I have to do, am I just stuck with one model? No, absolutely not. Why not mix them, right? Why not mix an inquiry model with problematizing the status quo? Maybe there are some good things about the industrial model. Maybe there are some good things about using a basal rater or being concerned with standards and, standardized education has some value. I don't know. Maybe there's components you want to mix and match. So this is your power as a teacher to mix and match these things. Okay. The second thing I'd like to talk about is 6 guiding principles for teaching literacy. The first guiding principle should be literacy practices are socially and culturally constructed. Now, the word constructed here is kind of a loaded term in education. Probably in your Bachelor of Education degree, you're learning all kinds of things about constructivism. So this comes from within that school of thought of constructivism. It's largely widely accepted in education these days as the way that we're to think about such things. So let's just deal with that for a minute, and we'll think about what this means. Literacy practices are socially and culturally constructed. What do constructivists mean by that when they say that? They mean that the classroom is a diverse place, and diversity is an asset, not a deficit. It's a resource. It's something that you draw upon, right? We shouldn't, feel, oh my gosh, this is horrible. How am I going to teach all these kids from all these different walks of life? I've got so much diversity in my classroom. Oh my God, what am I going to do? Well, draw upon each kid as a resource, right? Well, this one from Africa, boy, I bet she knows all kinds of really amazing things that she can teach everyone else. And this little boy from Mexico, oh, well, what does he know about, things that we take for granted here in Canada, like clean water and safety, What's it like in Mexico, right? Those sorts of things. Or what cultural differences, what different cultural attitudes do you have that we can really learn from and gain from? Children learn from others around them. What is literacy? And they learn expectations of behavior around different activities. So, for example, worksheets. Like if you're always doing worksheets, what do you do in your class? It makes it look like you've got pretty good classroom management because all your kids are quiet and it's individualized activity with one answer, right? But that sucks in a way. I mean, it's good to have some of that, right? But like, what about the idea that, maybe there's more than one answer to a thing, and maybe it's good to be talking and learning how to communicate and bounce ideas, and right? So worksheets are not the only way, and group discussion of stories, that requires etiquette, right? Learning how to communicate and disagree with people or share your ideas, and why there are perhaps many answers. Okay, that's one guiding principle. A second guiding principle is that literacy practices are purposeful. That is to say, they're used to organize life, right? So we use things like agendas. Not so much anymore, unfortunately, in schools. I don't know. I think it's a cost-cutting measure in schools. Often kids don't even carry around agendas, and they don't make it a daily habit of using agendas. I'm really pleased that my son's middle school, they've adopted the agenda. They've brought it back, whereas at his elementary school they stopped using it a couple years ago. Instead, went to teacher blogs, which I understand why they would do that, but at the same time, agendas, there's a certain I think there's a certain positive aspect of a child filling out an agenda and learning how to take account of his or her day and what things they did that day, and writing about that and using their literacy skills rather than just using the shortcut of a teacher blog, right? Anyway, so use literacy to organize your life. It's got real world practice application. And you use it to communicate, like letters and emails, right? Or you use it to entertain, to tell stories, to be creative, right? You use it to document your experiences, journals and memoirs and poems. Use it to make sense of the world, like books and the internet, and you use it to participate in social life. This is important stuff. If you can get kids using it in all these different ways, they're going to become more literate. It's not going to be just like see Dick run, see Jane chase, whatever. I don't know. But that's the idea, right? That if there's no heart behind these things, if there's no immediate reason why a child should learn how to read, then it's going to make it a heck of a lot more of a task than a delight to learn how to read, isn't it? Okay, a third component here. Literacy practices contain ideologies and values. Well, what does that mean? It means that very often within the ways that we teach kids, there are underlying assumptions, there are underlying values that we are trying to pass on to kids. Sometimes these things are very, what's the word I'm trying to look for? Sometimes the values that we're passing on to kids are very narrow, and that they tend to close down student awareness of broader aspects of life, right? Sometimes, for instance, like if you're in a school, say you're in a school where everything in the school is all about being the best you can be, and not just being the best you can be, but being better than everybody else. So it's very competitive, right? Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in such a school, kids get the idea that it's a war of all against all, that, it makes for a very competitive, unfriendly aspect. And it teaches kids certain things about their neighbors and their community, or lack thereof. We have to be careful and conscious about what we're teaching kids to value, what we're teaching kids as the underlying suppositions behind, what education is, right? And what will make them happy in the end of things. Are you going to be happy just because you come out on top in life? Just because you smash and you defeat your neighbor? What about that? I mean, many people are the cream of the crop, but they're terribly unhappy, and they make other people terribly unhappy, right? Is that what we really want in our society? So there are certain ideologies and values, right, that underlie literacy practices. Also, literacy practices are learned through inquiry, right? A teacher, could be seen as a problem poser here. So, as a problem poser, you're not necessarily saying, okay, I'm going to tell you. You're not the font of wisdom here, right? You're not the alpha and the omega of knowledge. You're posing problems for kids, maybe where they never saw there was a problem before, and then you're saying, okay, let's learn how to explore that. Let's learn how to, take our desire to know that we all have, like Aristotle says, right? All human beings desire to know, and let's learn how to be human. Let's learn how to explore and develop that desire to know, to cultivate it. So, literacy practices stem from this desire to know, this inquisitiveness we have. That's a different attitude, right, than saying that, okay, well, here are my outcomes, and all you kids, you're going to learn these things, and I'm going to make sure that it's a different attitude to say, that it's almost foisted upon them, forced upon them. They get to learn very quickly that what is school? It's finding out what the teacher wants me to know and learning how to know that and demonstrating that to him or her, right? That's very different attitude to school than it is through inquiry. And then a fifth element here, literacy practices invite readers and writers to use their background knowledge and cultural understandings to make sense of texts. So these texts, right, the best way to learn how to read is say, okay, well, let's read together, but let's also learn how to make sense of these texts by relating them to our own lives, relating them to our own family lives, relating them to our own cultures. We can learn from each other, and we can see that text or that book or whatever it is that we're reading from the different perspectives in our classroom, and we can learn from each other. And everybody feels a part of this, right? It doesn't matter if you're a high-level reader or a low-level reader. A high-level reader can learn an incredible amount from an ELL or an ESL kid who maybe struggles with the reading aspect, but can tell you make all kinds of connections and associations with the book. If, say, you're reading the book aloud to the children, and they say, oh, well, in my country, this is what we did, or in my family has this, this, and this, and the other kids can hear this, and they can really appreciate this and learn, make connections, right? A sixth element, and the final element here, is literacy practices expand to include everyday texts and multimodal texts. So, multimodal literacy, what is that? Well, that's the idea that digital media are a form of literacy development, right? Or if you play DVDs or films for your students, you have them engaged using a computer or gaming devices, the internet, MP3s, like texts, blogs, even cell phones. Like, certain teachers say all these things are different ways of enticing students into the life of literacy. Even though I don't like seeing personally my own daughters, on their cell phones all the time, texting and stuff. At the same time, texting's kind of interesting because it is literacy, isn't it? It's not necessarily, like when we were kids, you phone up your buddy on the phone, or you phone up your girlfriend on the phone, and you talk for an hour. Get off the phone! What are you doing on there all night? On the cell phone, it's very much different. They're always using the literacy skills. So they probably write a lot more than what we suppose they write. Now, in a different kind of cell phone language, right, with the different short forms and things, but nonetheless, it is a form of literacy. Third element I'd like you to consider here is areas critical for reading instruction and development. We have 5 areas I'd like you to consider here. First of all, phonemic awareness. There's a funny term, right? Perhaps you've already run across that in your B.Ed. What is phonemic awareness? It's the ability to hear sounds in words. Focus teaching on spoken syllables and words. So like the word focus there, right? Can you hear the different letters in that word? F, O, K, S, right? Can you hear each one of those items? Or teaching, right? Can you hear the different elements of the word? Hear the different syllables spoken, hear the different sounds spoken. That's very important for learning how to read. Also phonics, the relation between letters written and sounds spoken. This helps link the two for beginning readers. So, it's one of the strategies we have for learning how to read, isn't it, right? Sound it out. Well, not all words are able to be sounded out. Like I remember when I was a boy, there was this one, I guess it's kind of a politically incorrect book now. I can't remember what it was called, but it had these quote-unquote Indians in it, and there were these 3 Indians, and they had the headdresses and things, and they were laughing all the time in the whole book. But I didn't know what the word laughing was, because you can't sound that out. It was lagging, and the whole time I couldn't figure out what that was. I guess the tool that I had that was most pronounced for me as a reader was, the phonetic tool of sounding things out. I only thankfully with the help of the pictures in the book could I understand when I looked at the pictures and I saw the guys laughing. Then halfway through the book, I remember saying, "Oh, lagging, that's laughing," right? So phonics is a very important part of learning how to be a good reader. And then fluency. This is the ability to read with speed and accuracy, or proper expression. Use guided oral reading and silent reading, right? So fluency is an interesting one, right? I remember when I was a boy being really nervous and not feeling like I could read very well, like when, the teacher would ask all of us to stand up and we would read, in the old classroom. I staggered over the words, and I remember my one friend, Kevin, boy, he could read fluently. He was so smooth, man. He was, this is like grade 2, and I just remember the calm way that he could read, and he could read with expression and the rest of it. But fluency is only one part of the battle, right? Because you can read really fluently, say, but you might not understand a word of what it was that you just read. I mean, chances are if you've got expression in there, maybe you do. But if you're just reading fluently and you can read through with speed, accuracy, and that sort of thing, chances are that you may or may not understand what you just read. How do you measure for fluency? Well, different teachers, sometimes they use something called a running record, right, or a miscue analysis. You can look up on YouTube. There's different really good demos of how to do reading records, like or miscue analyses. The big book on that is by this lady. It's very famous. It's by Mary Clay. It's called Running Records. So you could get a copy of that from the library and read through that and practice it. Another critical area for reading instruction and development is vocabulary. So the repeated use of words in multiple contexts, building your vocabulary, right? They say it's very, very important, for kids to build their vocabulary. vocabulary is something that if you, at a young age, right, we should be working on ways to strengthen it. I mean, just think even, I don't know how many of you are English majors, but, when you were, say, reading George Orwell, 1984, back in your undergraduate, you would have encountered this idea of newspeak, right? And the idea that, you can control people's thoughts by limiting their language choices, right? If you don't have the thoughts to think about your experiences, your awareness of those experiences and all the nuances of those experiences and the connections they have with one another and the big ideas, and you simply can't think about your experiences without words to think those thoughts. And so what happens to your experiences? They kind of fade, right? They're dumbed down. They lack this nuance. And then there's whole vistas of our own lives that we pass over without having the vocabulary to think those things. So vocabulary is very important. And then a fifth thing is comprehension. So again, comprehension is different than fluency, right? It's knowing what you're reading, summarizing, monitoring, answering and generating questions, using graphic and semantic organizers. Okay, another thing I'd like you to consider is the problem of what is standard English. This reminds me, years ago, when I finished my undergraduate degree, I was kind of sick of living in Ontario, and I wanted to change, and I was longing to see something that was new and different, and I had this real interest in maritime music. I loved the music of Stan Rogers. I got introduced to it when I was in high school as a kid, and I used to play in a folk and blues club, which was wonderful in Port Dover, Ontario. And anyway, long and short of the story is I decided I could move either as far as I could possibly west in Canada, which would be BC, or I could move as far as possible east, which would be Newfoundland. And so I decided to go to Newfoundland, and boy, I was so glad I went there. I mean, I remember when I moved out there, I didn't have anywhere to live, and and it was all new to me. It was such a new, beautiful place with diverse people. And so I found a little place to live for the first month or so, and I didn't know anybody yet, and I was from away, right? When they say from away. And so there's this beautiful pub down there. If you ever go to Water Street in St. John's, Newfoundland, there's a place called Aaron's Pub. And I went visiting down in there, and boy, the people were so friendly. Like, I remember walking in, and this great big man, like a huge, fisherman kind of guy. He had his hand was the size of somebody's like a baseball glove, and I just remember him, and it was like a huge, strong, powerful grip he had, and he shook my hand, and we sat down. And very quickly I got to know all different people in this pub, and there was live music there, and I was sitting down talking to one of the fellas, and in Newfoundland, it's a very interesting place in Canada, folks. If you've never been there, people have all different dialects of English there, and you're like, wow, that doesn't sound right, or this or that, and sometimes you don't exactly know what folks are saying, right? Because even though it's English, you don't know the expressions, you don't know the accent, you don't know the particular dialect. It takes a while, but and one of the fellas knew that I was from Ontario, and we just got talking about the King's English, right? And he was saying, the type of English we speak out here in Newfoundland, people from outside of here, often they'll say that we're not speaking proper English, but this is the King's English. He says this is as proper as any other kind of English, and it's more of a prejudice against Newfoundland dialects to suppose that it isn't proper, and that kind of always stuck with me. I was really careful about that, and actually one of the great delights of living in a place like that is you learn how to you learn something about the language and the culture, and through the different ways people use words, you start to see the world slightly differently. And there are these beautiful expressions that people have, turns of phrase. So the point of this is, here you are, you're a teacher, and you want to ensure, you're teaching English language arts. You want to ensure that your kids are learning correct English, right? Learning how to speak and write grammatically. Well, okay, how are you going to do that? What is the standard of correctness, right? Well, this is a danger too. If people come from different parts of the world where the English language, or say the French language or whatever, is spoken slightly differently, are you going to crack down on them? Are you going to say, no, that's unacceptable, you can't speak that way because this is Canada, or this is not Newfoundland, this is Central Ontario, or this is Calgary, Alberta, and we don't speak that way here? Or are you going to somehow honor that and incorporate that in and allow that to be recognized in your daily practices, in your literacy development in your classrooms, right? So these are things to consider. I think probably the best thing to consider is that there's lots of linguistic variation in English and no single standard of correctness. Only a vast array of registers and dialects. Well, what's a register? It's the way a language is used. So king's speech is different than a peasant's speech by formalities, right? They're both speaking English, but a king speaks differently than a peasant. And also dialect, right? So dialect can be influenced by race, class, region, and age, those sorts of things. So keep this in mind, right? Don't necessarily, go to the extreme and say that you have to learn. Like in Pygmalion, did you guys remember reading that in high school? You had to read Pygmalion, George Bernard Shaw, and the idea that the only way out of your class, the only way out of your station in life is to learn how to speak properly, speak kind of like upper crust society English, and so we're going to train you to speak that way. This is even today, it's part of upward mobility, is learning how to not speak improperly in your class. Well, maybe there is some virtue in that, but maybe also it's really important for you as a teacher to honor and respect and even cultivate a certain understanding for diverse use of language. So we can look at language or diverse dialects or registers as a positive or a negative thing. And I would suggest to you probably the best thing you can do is look at it more positively. Okay, 3 points on language practice here. First point, language practices are dialogic and evolving. What does that mean? Well, languages change, and language use is borrowed or mixed with what you learn from others in conversation, right? So large part of your language classes will be conversational, one would hope, right? Especially, imagine if you have you will have ELL or ESL kids in your class. Well, one of the best ways for them to learn is through conversation, through very, thick conversations, interactions with their peers, with you, with other people. And then, 2, language practices are culturally and socially situated. So there's this thing called code switching. What is that? Well, it's switching between dialects and languages or ways of speaking. We can switch between formal and informal speech. So, for instance, I'm a high school English teacher. One of the challenges when you teach high school English is to get kids to understand that the way that I talk, the way that you talk, and we're in a conversation with one another, and we're informally conversing, is much different than the way that we write. When we write, a different level of expectation is there for grammar, for structures, than there is for when I'm speaking. Like I say, I say, I say and, I say like, right? But we wouldn't do that if we were simply if we were writing, right? Similarly, so if you're speaking to your friend, you speak using different language out in the hallway than you do than if you're speaking to the principal, or than if you're speaking to the Queen of England, or something like that, right? Number 3, language practices reflect power and politics. So language can include or it can exclude people. So we have to be careful about that. When I speak, when I use language, who's being included, who's being excluded. There are these things called cueing systems. There are 4 cueing systems in literacy development identified by Goodman. What are they? Well, there's the phonological or sound system, the semantic or meaning system, the syntactic or structural system, and the pragmatic or social cultural use system. Let's go through these. Number 1, the graphophonemic system. This concerns the shapes of letters, the sounds that they evoke. It recognizes that language uses and sounds and letters to make written and spoken words. Here we pay close attention to the sounds and symbols of a language, and we develop what's called phonemic awareness. Okay, so you're looking actually at the sound of individual letters, or in words, being able to identify those in words, like big, ig, right? The onset and the rhyme here. Well, what is a phoneme? It's the smallest unit of sound in a language. There are 42 in English, so there's 20 vowel sounds and 24 consonant sounds. And phonetics and phonics, what's that? It's studying how we segment various phonemes. That's phonetics. And phonics is the term for the relation between letters and sounds. So early school focuses on onsets and rhymes, like in that diagram there. And the onset is what precedes the vowel in a word, up to 3 consonants. And the rhyme is the vowel and what follows. Okay, so we'll often, when we're learning how to spell, when we're learning how to read, we'll break words into the onset and the rhyme. And then you have the same rhyme and you'll change the onset, or you'll have the onset and you'll change the rhyme. And you'll get the kids saying, oh, well, different words are very similar, but just depending on what the onset and the rhyme is, you can make that quite different words, but although they're similar in sound. And then semantics. This is the meaning of words, okay? So an example would be running down the street versus running for a seat in the next election. The same word, but running down the street is quite different, right? It means like you're moving your legs really quickly going down the street, versus running for a seat. You're not actually running, but you're applying democratically for a seat to represent people in an election. It's different, right? It's a different use of the word. So semantics is to do with that. Vocabulary is a big deal here. Kids know around 5,000 words by the time they enter school, and around 50,000 words by the end of high school. That's a big jump, isn't it? They learn some of these through formal language instruction, but lots of them are learned informally through reading and in the course of other studies. So, example, think of all the different meanings for the word fire. Can you think of different words or different meanings for this word fire? You know, you got fired, there's a fire, I fire a gun, right? Lots and lots of different meanings for the word fire. And you learn them as you go along. What's a morpheme? It's the smallest linguistic unit that carries meaning in a word. It may be either free or bound. So a free morpheme, examples of that are things like dog, fox, walk, fast. And a bound morpheme, examples like, you have a plural s, or an ed, or an ing, or a pre, or a post. Those things are attached to another word, and then they change the meaning of it slightly, right? So it's all about meaning. Here's a question: what word would you? Oh my gosh, Nice sentence there, Sean. What word would you expect to occur based on the meaning of the sentence so far? Number 3. Syntactics. Right? This is different than when you ask the question, what word would you expect to occur based on the meaning of the sentence so far? If you're using that as a strategy, it's a semantic strategy, right? You're thinking about, here I have a word that I don't recognize as a new learner in literacy. I'm not sounding it out, but I'm looking at it in context of the rest of the sentence, and what is the word that I would expect to occur here? What meaning? You're trying to solve it by meaning. See, number 3, syntactics is slightly different here. The structural organization of language, the rules of grammar, how words are combined into sentences. So in English we say, this is my red sweater, not this is my sweater red. Some other languages, they actually invert the order or switch the order around, right? So this can be kind of confusing for ELL kids, where they've learned that syntactically sentences and meanings in sentences are organized differently than in English, right? So it takes a while. It takes some practice. So syntax, what's that? It's the study of systematic ways in which words and sentences are organized and related to one another. So, for example, where to put the verbs, the nouns, the adjectives, etc. in the sentences. Orthography, the way that language is organized in written text using punctuation, spelling, and capitals. Orthography, just think of that. Ortho means correct, and graphe means writing, right? So correct writing, the way that language is written correctly, right, using these formalities of punctuation, spelling, and capitals. And then affixes, things that you add to words to change their meaning, like suffixes and prefixes. So a question that you would ask, say you were using a syntactic decoding approach, you're a new reader. What part of speech or word would make sense based on the grammar of the language? Right? So you look directly at where the word is in the sentence in situation to other words, and can you guess from its situation in the sentence, syntactic situation in the sentence, what that word might mean? So these are different strategies that kids can use, right? There's sounding things out, there's looking for meaning, there's looking at where a word falls in a sentence. Then also, there's pragmatics. So language in use, right? Seeing that different people use language differently. So children speak differently than adults, or social context, power matters, prose versus poetry. So, if you ever read, people still read Huckleberry Finn, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and you'll see that dialects, are included in Mark Twain's writing. Not just dialects, but also, children speak is part of Mark Twain. Children speak differently than adults, right? Or social context matters, power matters. If you're writing prose, that's different than poetry. How people write differs according to their purpose and their audience. One of the things that still happens here in grade 9 in Alberta is we have what's called functional writing, where kids are still taught how to write formal business letters. So if they have to apply for a job, or if they're involved in some kind of business oriented writing, they'll write differently in that particular circumstance than they will if they're writing a personal letter or an email, right? This is part of your task as a teacher, is to teach them how language has different purposes, different meanings. Language varies among social classes, ethnic groups, geographic regions, and dialects. Sometimes it takes a great deal of practice to understand the pragmatics of language. For example, speaking and writing language, these things are different. So the question that you ask as a person who's learning how to read, struggling with a text, right? The other ways are available to you, but this is another way, is what is the function of this text, right? Is this a letter? Is it a personal letter? Is it a formal letter? Is it a newspaper article? Is it a poem? Is it a piece of prose? Is it trying to sell me something? What is it, a recipe? Is it a set of directions to how to get to somebody's house? What is it? And then that will help you be able to decode it better. So you'll be helping students not just identify not just the purpose or use of things that they're reading, but also you'll be helping them to craft their own compositions according to use or purpose, right? So they should be able to, in your class, try not just like, writing poetry, or not just writing essays, or not just writing a story, but also other different kinds of writing, right? Like, what about technical writing? What about writing a list of items that, for shopping? What about, you can imagine different kinds of practical uses for literacy that would be very important. Here's a list here, right? There's descriptive writing, there's expository writing, journals and letters, there's narrative writing, persuasive writing, poetry writing, right? There's different purposes for these different kinds of writing, and there's different activities that you might associate with in your class, getting kids to try these different forms so that they get a sense that writing has all different, and maybe I don't feel necessarily, comfortable with this kind of writing, but that doesn't make me a bad writer, because I really, find value in this other kind, and I have some kind of aptitude in it, right? So in doing of compositions is likely one of the best ways to learn about purpose or use. So, try to introduce in your classrooms different kinds of writing activities all the time. So, by the way, these lists, where are they? Here's an excellent book for you. I highly recommend it to you. It's kind of pricey, unfortunately, but Gail Tompkins, Literacy for the 21st Century, excellent book, full of excellent tools, resources for you, all about literacy. Highly recommended. She gives you a breakdown of these four systems, right? The phonological system, the syntactic system, the semantic system, and the pragmatic system. She gives you a breakdown of the different terms associated with those different systems and different applications in your class. Like, what would it look like to practice the phonological system? What would it look like in my class to practice the syntactic system? How can I help kids develop decoding skills that employ the semantic system, right? There's some applications, and same with the pragmatic system, okay? So, nice. Her book is full of charts like this. It's a great resource for you as a student teacher learning about literacy for your classroom. Getting to know students, developing culturally relevant practices for reading and writing. So just think about, here's another excellent book, another textbook by Flint from 2008. Flint stresses, the importance of paying attention to the divide between teachers' culture and students' culture, right? We very often will assign one way of doing things, one textbook, one story. But what about if we want kids from all around, the world who populate our classrooms to engage in reading, engage in writing, engage in literacy? They have to be able to see themselves in there. They have to find some relevance and some association between themselves and whatever it is they're reading. That will help them, right? So we should engage that. We should find ways of bringing in cultural diversity, not looking at it as an impediment, but as an enriching source for our classrooms. So emphasize the need to learn about students' home community practices, right? Make that part of your literacy practice. Kids learn and write about their own homes. They tell others about their own home and community practices. Also get them speaking about making use of students' funds of knowledge. What's a fund of knowledge? That's kind of education speak for just finding out whatever it is that kids know from their own past, from their lives at home, from growing up with their families and their friends and their culture, and being able to share that with others and drawing upon that and making that the base or the foundation for whatever it is that they learn in your classroom, right? All the cultural stuff that children bring to the classroom with them, that's funds of knowledge. Culturally relevant pedagogy. This is important, right? Teaching that meets the needs, the academic and social needs of diverse students. Canada is a culturally diverse, multicultural place, right? We are officially multicultural in Canada. We're bilingual officially, but we're multicultural officially as well. So we want to use good learning materials. We want to culturally relevant pedagogy in our classrooms. We want to take learning to take place in environments that are inclusive, right? So that, if you are from this or that culture, you don't feel excluded by it, right? This is part of, right now in Canada, this is just before the big election. I don't know how it's going to pan out, but this is something that is creating great division in Canada right now. 2015, we have certain politicians, not necessarily being so inclusive, right? Creating, certain wedge issues based on culture. Us versus them mentalities. We don't want that. If politicians want to do that, we're not politicians, thank God. We're teachers, and our job is to make sure everybody feels included in our classrooms, right? We have to fight against this nonsense that happens in politics. We have to make sure that everybody in our classrooms feels included. And one of the things we can do is include culturally relevant pedagogy. Help student relates to diverse lives, their diverse lives to school-related experiences, right? We help connect students' background, knowledge, and personal experiences to literacy events. So, for instance, using multicultural texts, literature discussions, dialogue journals, and writing about your own experiences in journal or diary format, right? So, lots of different ways of allowing kids to write about their own background and cultural history. I remember teaching high school, and I had a boy from China. His family, I think they were recent immigrants. He was ELL when he came to my class. The finest bit of writing he did for me that whole year, and I can't remember what the assignment was, but he wrote about, was it his uncle? Someone who was over in China during Tiananmen, the Tiananmen massacre, and he just wrote about the persecution and the difficulties and the challenges that his family or his uncle had experienced during that time in his life, and it was really, really touching. It was good writing. It's real writing too. It's not necessarily the same thing as, here's a book that we read, now answer these questions, or give me your thoughts on the characters or this or that. That's important to be able to look at a text, but here he's actually looking at his own life, the life of his family, the life of his uncle. It's something that matters to him, and it was by far and above the best bit of writing he gave me. And, then we went through writing processes with it too, right? I still had the opportunity to help him with grammar and expression and sentence structure, paragraph writing, idea formation, all these things. It was still possible. It was just a different venue for it. Well, here's 4 basic ideas about what learning to read means. Some folks focus more on focusing on skills, right? Like the back to basics thing, focusing on skills. Another, understanding the meaning of words. 3, learning to bring meaning from a text and how to get meaning from a text. And 4, critically examining a text. What about if you combine all 4 of these things? It's probably better than just thinking about the one thing. Sometimes, maybe, too, we'll find our own pedagogy in our classroom might be kind of top-heavy in one of those 4 areas, or 2 of those 4 areas or something, or 3 of those 4 areas. We might be leaving one out. So keep these things in mind and say, in my classroom, am I offering a balanced literacy program, right, that involves each of these 4 elements? Well, what about focusing on skills? So there's this bottom-up theory of literacy. What is that? Well, it means that learning to read occurs in small steps, from simple to more complex, like building blocks. There's lots of stress here on behavioral controls, like rewards and punishments, the use of textbooks, flashcards, and worksheets. So it's very, very traditional idea, right? You go from simple to complex. But maybe maybe learning doesn't always work that way, right? Maybe in some ways, in your everyday life, I mean, you've probably experienced it where you have a complex thing, and it's very complex before it gets simple, right? It relies on a skills model. Breaks reading into word analysis, vocabulary, comprehension, stress on phonics first approaches, right? These things are valuable, but you can see how, in a way, they might be a learning killer, right? Can you imagine maybe how there might be no heart in this? There might be no interest in this at all. It might be very mechanical. It might be very factory kind of oriented learning or education here. So you see, it's associated very often with basal materials, where you have a new word list followed by the reading of the story and working on reading skills like predicting, summarizing, and finding the main idea, and comparing and contrasting, as well as reading comprehension questions, right? All stuff that we typically do as teachers, but maybe, and not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but what about if you do that? That's all you do all the time. Couldn't that potentially kill kids' interests in reading? I mean, it's hard enough to get the kids read anything outside of class because they're not being forced to, but maybe part of it is just because this is the way that their exposure to interaction with reading in the life of literature is structured for them ever since they encounter books, right? Maybe this, even though it has certain benefits, maybe it actually kills, students' interest in books and learning and reading, literacy. Another aspect, understanding the meaning of words. Here we can have things like theme cycles, so units initiated by either students or teachers, like animals or rocks or planets or dinosaurs or cities. Like, this can be awesome, right? Oh, like during the Olympics a few years ago, a teacher friend of her family here, because the Olympics was on, everything in her class was all Olympics all the time, right? And she interdid that. She interdisciplinariized, or that's not a word, but she, Olympics can be, there's all kinds of reading you can associate with Olympics. It's all kinds of math, all kinds of social studies and geography and science, right? All these things can be developed as a kind of a theme cycle. And you get this very often, right? Kids love dinosaurs, kids love rocks, kids love animals, all the different ways that you can do a kind of a theme cycle. That's one way. Another way is this top-down theory, right? Instead of from the bottom up, right? What about from the top down? So integrate student interests and needs into the curriculum because meaning is most important. Right? If you start with the idea that the meaning of things is most important, not the nuts and bolts, not the skills-based stuff, not the, not all that, but the actual meaning. Like, you won't care about anything that you're reading unless it has some kind of meaning to you, right? Like, who cares about see Dick run and see whatever, right? Reading won't matter elsewise. Skills on their own don't really engage. Right? Ask yourself, right? Am I just doing a more skills-based program? Maybe there's dangers in that. Maybe I should also think about the importance of meaning, making this a meaningful experience for my students. Also, there's the whole language model, and I know whole language, is thought of as this horrible travesty that's destroyed student learning, and everybody needs to get back to phonics and all this stuff and blah blah. But really, whole language, it means phonics is only part of it. That there are 4 cueing systems, the ones that we talked about, right? The graphophonemic, the syntactic, the semantic, and the pragmatic. And all these need to be activated when kids are learning. Okay, the third aspect here, learning to read means learning how to respond to a text. The stress here is, you could stress reading journals as springboards to writing, right? You have a reading journal. What does that mean? You record what kids are reading. They write about what they're reading, different kinds of things that they're reading. And the teacher looks for connections in student journals. And students are expected to share their ideas with others in small groups. So it's not just you're on your own reading. You're telling other people about what you're reading. You're in small groups. You're talking about books. It relies on a transactional theory of learning. Well, what's that? It means that no two readers interpret a text exactly the same. It's like when you go see a movie and you really loved it, and then the guy next to you is like, oh, that sucked, right? Or this book, oh, I love that book, and then the next person can't stand it. Or music's like that, especially with teenagers, right? Oh, I love this kind of music. I can't stand this kind of music. That's more of a generational thing too, right? The music that I love, my kids think is lame, and the music that they love, it doesn't even sound like music to me. It sounds like somebody, I don't know, killing a cat or something. We all bring our own experiences to a text. So, for instance, Jabberwocky's an amazing one, right? If you've ever, 'twas brillig in the slithy toves, did Garen gimble upon the wabe, right? What the heck does that mean? Well, one of the things that Lewis Carroll is really great at is like, okay, you read this poem, and then, if you do it with your kids, you'll find that every kid, when you ask them to try to translate that into regular schmegular English, every kid has a slightly different image of what that scene is. Like, what does that mean? One kid will say, oh, well, the Jabberwocky poem starts with being out in this meadow. No, it's a mountain. No, it's a swamp, right? Different kids will interpret it different ways. It's different. There's no two readers interpret it exactly the same. We all bring our own experiences to a text. This theory invites teachers and students to take ideas or images from a text and use them in their own thinking and writing. The other thing about this is that it operates using a reader response model. So what's a reader response model? Well, it links texts together. So there's what we call intertextuality. There's links between text and self, texts and other texts, and texts in the world. So it's not just skills based. It's like, it's important to be able to, if you're going to understand and appreciate a book or a text, you have to be able to say, okay, well, how does this relate to me in my life? Or, you make links from one text to another text. That's, what's similar between, say you're doing, fairy tales, and you're looking at, like Cinderella myths, right? Cinderella stories. We have the Cinderella story from like Disney or whatever, but there are Cinderella stories all around the world, right? We could make links across text. Well, what's similar? What's different, right? Or text to world, right? What is this text? How does it link? How does it relate to the world? So these are important things, and they all go back to meaning and relevance, right? If something's relevant that kids are reading, it'll matter more. There'll be a higher stake in actually literacy. It won't just be this simple process of learning how to sound out a word and break it up into its syllables and demonstrate that you know how to spell it correctly and how to use it correctly in a sentence and things like that. That's one way of understanding literacy. But if that's all you did, you could really mutilate and mangle and destroy a student's love of learning. So the teacher's role is to ask, in this model, the teacher's role is to ask about or clarify the connections students make to see if they're on track. And 4, learning to read means to critically examine a text. Right? So you're asking questions about this text. You're learning to be suspicious of what you read. I think this is particularly important. I mean, it's always been important, but maybe even more now because everybody's on the damn internet all the time, right? And the internet's full of stupidity and lies. And how do you read critically? How do you make decisions about what's good and what's fair and what's just? So it actually focuses kids on thinking about fairness and justice. Critical theories see literacy as not just technical skill, but as a social practice, right? You're reading a story. If the story's told from the point of view of the victor, well, what about the people who lost, right? What about the people who are disenfranchised in this story? What about them? It encourages students to question texts about missing voices and power. Who doesn't get to speak in this story? What do you think they might say if they had a chance to speak? Why don't you write me or tell me a story about that, or why don't you write a story about that, or act it out for me? Try to look at the everyday through new lenses from different perspectives. And the underlying intent here is advocacy and social activism. So, if you are concerned with matters of social justice in your class, and you think that this is an important element of what you're doing in your classroom, then this idea of critical theories or critical literacy will be very important for you. And it makes use of the 4-resource model, right? There's code breaking here, knowing in relation to between sounds and graphic systems. There's no reason why you can't do that. There's text participants, right? You're understanding a text using your own experiences, right? My experiences in relation to other people's experiences that maybe don't appear in this text. There's the text user, the pragmatics. Is this text being used to try to sell me something or make me believe something? Well, how does that work in relation to these other people who maybe are on the receiving end of that in a negative sense, right? Or critical practices. You see the reasoning, see the opinions, the biases in a text. Okay, so that's a nice little brief introduction to literacy, the topic of literacy for you. I hope it was helpful for you today. Thanks for listening.